Hello again. In this video 201 I will go over chapter 6, Sub-Saharan Africa, and in this section, this particular part, I will go over the environment, the population problems, and some of the features of the culture of this region of the world. The physical environment in Sub-Saharan Africa is really wild. I mean, there's big plateaus in East Africa and mountains, and it's very low and at sea level in West Africa. One of the biggest problems is desertification, which is the expansion of the desert-like conditions as a result of human-induced degradation. This is a problem in this region of the world, and it usually begins with deforestation, as we've seen in some of the other regions. And many scientists are also concerned about drought in the Horn of Africa, which has been going on off and on for the last couple of decades. Parts of southern Africa and the Sahel. The Sahel is a zone of ecological transition between the Sahara Desert to the north and the wetter savannas to the south. Life depends on a delicate balance of limited rain, drought-resistant plants, and a pattern of animal transhumance, which is a geology term that you should be familiar with. This is the movement of animals between wet season and dry season pasture lands. And camels and goats predominate in this particular transhumanist type movement. In the 1970s, there was a lot of rain, and the Sahel became overpopulated and overused because this was unusual, and they haven't had that wet weather really since. Pastoral nomadism is another type of existence in this region of the world. It's a form of subsistence agriculture where people depend on the seasonal movement of livestock for their livelihood. And after the drought of the late 60s and early 70s, again, the weather changed and it became wetter, and more people moved into the Sahel, and they began to do cattle raising and ranching on a scale that was really too much for that region. And they overexpanded, and it led to the loss of natural vegetation, and eventually there were declines in soil fertility. Peanut farming was something done by the French colonialists, and it was continued with the newly independent countries, and that also impacted the loss of fertile soil. If you keep growing commercial products or commercial crops continually year after year, decade after decade, eventually the fertility declines severely. And when the soil becomes degraded, winds carry away the topsoil if you've been chopping all the trees down as well, and eventually when it does get wet, the rains wash what is left away, and then what you have left after that is the spreading of the desert. There's nothing left to absorb the rains when they come in, and the future of this part of sub-Saharan Africa is uncertain. What's going to happen with the rain? Too much rain? Not enough? Dry? We've been talking about deforestation. Much of sub-Saharan Africa has little tree cover. North of the equator, only a few wooded areas remain. And this aggravates, as we've been talking about, you should be familiar with this idea by now. It aggravates problems of runoff, soil erosion, and shortages of biofuels. In the southern tropical savanna, Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, and Tanzania have sections with dry woodland remaining. And in Kenya, under the leadership of Wangari Maathai, the Green Belt movement was an attempt to replant trees, and she was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 2004 for her efforts. Many other countries in Africa became interested in the program, and some of these regions are still undergoing severe deforestation. Wildlife conservation is another issue. Wildlife has been declining. Historically, this part of Africa didn't have a lot of human beings living there because of all the disease that were possible to catch while you were living in that area. But in the 20th century, as we have seen, one of the triumphs of the 20th century has been the eradication of many diseases, and now there are more human beings living in these regions of sub-Saharan Africa, and as a result, the wildlife has been slowly being killed off, and poaching is a major problem, especially for rhinoceroses and elephants, because ivory is a very, very lucrative item to sell, especially in Japan. And the Convention on International Trades on Endangered Species tried to stop this ivory trade, and several states then complained in the late 90s that the herds were actually coming back and that they needed to be culled, and that resulting ivory sales then could help pay for more conservation. And there's still arguments over these policies today. Population, and there's been more education here in the 2010s, but prior to this decade, AIDS was a major, major problem in sub-Saharan Africa. It was ground zero for the AIDS epidemic ravaging Africa. 20% of the population was infected at one time. And as a result, life expectancy has declined. All classes of people have been affected. And in some areas, the life expectancy has only been in the low 40s. That is the beginning of the 20th century life expectancy in the West. But antiretroviral drugs have been introduced. And these drugs have been very effective in prolonging the lives of people who have HIV. Magic Johnson is the classic example. He has been taking these drugs for decades now. But they're just beginning to disseminate these, and it's helped some. Also, education on prevention of contracting the virus has also helped. And unfortunately, women have bared a disproportionate burden of the epidemic, and they have been more likely than men to be affected. Massive education programs have been ongoing, and that has helped to stop the rise in the infection levels as we compared to what they were 20 years ago. Sub-Saharan Africa is the least urbanized region in the developing world, but it seems that 50% of the region's population, and that's the key percentage, it's estimated that 50% of the world is going to be urban by 2025, not too far away. Urban sprawl is happening in some of the bigger cities. Historically, Timbuktu, the current textbook has a different spelling for this. I can't remember it off the top of my head. This is the old traditional spelling of Timbuktu. This was a great Muslim learning center in ancient times. And West Africa was most developed pre-colonial urban network before colonial times of the 1800s. Here are some of the other huge cities. Lagos, Nigeria. That's a wrong figure. I know there's more than that today. That's a dated statistic. It's over 14 million people just in that city alone. Nigeria is very urban. There are serious problems there as a result of many different tribal groups and different religions being forced to live because of the colonial boundaries that were established that didn't take these ancient, as we'll see, these ancient tribal patterns of living into consideration. Here are some other urban industrial areas in South Africa. This is the most industrialized country in Africa, and there is still impact of the old apartheid policies, which were legal segregation of the races. That's all been eliminated in the 1990s. And Cape Town and Johannesburg are very urban areas. They are very westernized in that sense because they are diverse economies and many people come from other parts of Africa to work there. And in terms of culture, what we can say about sub-Saharan Africa is that it's a region with similar livelihood systems and a shared colonial past. Nigeria's official language is English, but these are some of the other languages that are actually spoken in that country. Some of the other language groups, the Niger, Congo, Swahili was the most widely spoken sub-Saharan language. It originated as a language of commerce, and that's what allowed it to spread. As these different regions of Africa traded with one another, this language spread. And new groups form when war leads different people to leave war-ravaged areas to more or less settled areas through time, and then blending with other groups, new languages were formed. And eventually, tribes, groups of families or clans with common kinship, language, and definable territory were developed in African history. And most are loyal to this group instead of the nation state that was established because of colonialism. Colonial administrators wanted to establish social order, and they attempted to fix tribal boundaries, but they did not take into regard the historic social systems or territories. As a result, a cultural map is formed that's very flawed. Some tribes are split up, names have no meaning indigenously, and the territories were misinterpreted. And these boundaries that were established by the colonial powers are stabilizing as individual languages are recognized and spoken on the national level, but European languages during the colonial period were used. And that's why French is spoken in Northwest Africa, English is spoken in the South, German might be spoken in places of Tanzania. Ethiopia was the only country to remain independent during the colonial times. And if there is a common religion, it was animist. That's the historic African religion. It's not part of the three main religions of the world of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And also Hindu is a major religion because India has over 1 billion people. Animists worship nature and ancestral spirits. Christianity was spread by the colonialists, and Ethiopians adopted the Coptic form of Christianity, and the leadership for Coptic Christianity comes from Egypt. And Europeans introduced Christianity to other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Black Southern African Christians like Bishop Desmond Tutu were very instrumental in bringing an end to the apartheid system. Missionaries introduced Christianity to other parts. Islam came in over 1,000 years ago, and Senegal became the first country to convert. And Nigeria has big problems between different tribes who have different religions. And there have been major wars fought in Nigeria between these different religious groups. Darfur suffered huge wars between 2004 and 2010. 300,000 Muslims of different ethnic groups were killed, and 2 million people were displaced. And eventually, the country of South Sudan was established, and the UN recognized it in 2012. And this was established for the Muslim populations. But generally speaking, there is very little religious warfare for a region with such diversity. And this ends the first 3 parts of sub-Saharan Africa.